welcome to the Theosophical Society in Detroit. Many of you have already been there. Some of you are members. And so we're very happy to be together, even though it's on Zoom. We delayed the get-together, the regular get-together at the lodge, but we have found Zoom to be a very great way to gather. Yeah, that's right. Got some thumbs up there. So, and it's comfortable we don't have to go anywhere. And then when it's wintry, it's going to be even nicer. We're going to say, wow, we're really glad that we've got Zoom, which we did last year. But just to let you know that the members now, we are meeting, we're trying to, this time it kind of there was a flood watch and we decided it was safer to not meet in person. But this Tuesday, we will have members gather. And so we're trying to do that like maybe once a month. It kind of just depends on how it goes. So I just wanted to let you know that those would be occurring on Tuesdays at 7 p.m. for that time that we get together. So first and foremost, I want to remind us that the Theosophical Society in Detroit is a local lodge, and it's part of a larger worldwide organization, the Theosophical Society. The national one is the Theosophical Society in America, and then we are underneath that. And so we follow the same three objects of the International Society. And that is, the first is to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity, regardless of race, sex, creed, caste, or color. And the second is to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science. The third is to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in humanity. And we have, in many ways, Joseph Alexander's talk is going to relate to the third one, I would say in particular, because we're talking about the evolution of consciousness. But he will, of course, share with you what he sees through the hidden motifs in the fairy tale. So I won't say a thing about that. But I do want to also let you know that we are a nonprofit organization, as you know. So we have a building and there are bills to pay. And even if we're not there physically, for us to even be able to get together really depends on that, the availability of like that physical building. This is how we eventually gather in person. And so we don't want to lose that building. We want to keep it going and keep it strong. And if you were part of the book sale in any way, I want to thank you for that, because that was a really important part of this lodge. It has been for many years, and in particular during COVID, it was extremely needed. So that was a wonderful success. So thank you for that. So I want to introduce Joseph Alexander, and I got to talk to him a little bit at the park when we met over the summer. The lodge met members, and it was my first conversation with him, and it was a joy. And then I just said, we really need to have him come over, because 2-3 years ago he said he would talk to us about his book, but it wasn't far enough along for him, and whatever reasons he had. So he said, I'm going to wait. And so we waited patiently. And finally, we no longer have to wait, because he agreed and he's here, and that's very exciting. So we're going to get to hear about his research that he's done over quite a long span of time. So Joseph is an artist and an oil painter, and he's been writing. And so just to give you a little background, if you haven't read it already, he received a degree in architecture in 1973, and he worked as a house painter, a muralist, and a fine artist for 25 years. Over the past 10 years, he's restricted his research to the spiritual meaning of the motifs and symbols found in mythology and fairy tales. And he studied the concept of Kundalini as found in Eastern philosophy of enlightened master Sri Aurobindo, Gopi Krishna, and from his own experiences. So he applies the idea of the evolution of consciousness with his knowledge and visual images to decipher the secrets of ancient literature. So we always get to read the work of people who go deep into this world, but we never really get to speak to somebody in person. And so I'm really looking forward to that today. So with that, thank you so much, Joe, for being here, and I'd like to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. This has been a long process. I started out, well, years ago, probably 1975, I got in touch with Gopi Krishna, and he was in Toronto, and they had the Kundalini research group. So I did some book covers for them. It just fit into the ideas that were coming to me and my energy, the way it felt. And in the Westers, at that time, there was absolutely no one talking about Kundalini or Shakti or even higher states of consciousness. It was just basically drug addicts, or it was a crazy world in the 60s. So I found some of his books, and I actually went up to Flesherton, Ontario, and they called themselves the friend. They published Gopi Krishna's books. There was a group there. So I studied his ideas for over 10, 15 years, and I had my own experience when I was about 29 or 30 of the Kundalini rising up my back like a serpent and exploding in my head with this gigantic light. And I knew about it before this happened, which was interesting. And it took a long time to get my health back together. I've always been a little, not the greatest health, because you have to clean your system to a very high degree to have the energy flow right. So that's been a real struggle with me, but I found just doing physical exercise and working with the body is one of the best practices. It's not necessarily lifting weights and just doing yoga and all that. And after that, I started to get into, it's good 20 years later, I started to read Aurobindo and his whole concept of spiritual evolution, which actually coincides with Gopi Krishna's. And after all these years, and about 2011, I moved to Nevada. And I was there for like 10 years. And that's when I was semi-retired. I was living by my sister there in Reno. So I started to read up on all the mythologies and how they relate to the evolution of consciousness. And I found all these different symbols. It was incredible. And what really, I actually wrote probably 100,000-page book on it, but it became much too complicated. So I figured I'll look into the fairy tales. And it was very, very obvious that there was something going on there. And the different motifs, the different symbols that are in the fairy tales. And the basic idea behind fairy tales and stories is that the child is not a grown-up. It's not an adult that's going through this. It's not a child, actually. It's your psyche, it's your soul that's experiencing all this. So when all the fairy tales start out as this little child, like Little Red Riding Hood, it's actually your higher self, your soul that experiences all this, but it's done through symbols. So let me start with, I'm going to share the screen and show an outline of a history of fairy tales, because they started as folklore. In other words, they were passed on by word of mouth. They weren't written until somewhere in France around the 1730s. So before that time, adults would pass the fairy tales on as storytellers to other people in their family. They wouldn't read them just to children. And they were entertainment in one sense, but at the same time, there's so many deep psychological complexes that it makes them interesting, more interesting than just a regular tale. Let me share this screen here. Okay. All right. So I want to start out with this one quote: "Those who tell stories rule society." Just think about that for a long time and meditate on it, and you'll see that the very basic ideas of what a human is comes from our religious stories. I mean, if you look at the Bible, you look at the Quran, you look at the Avesta, the Vedas, all those determine what we think we are as humans. You know, if you're in the Bible, if you're biblical or Christian, there's going to be a Christ who saves you at the end of your life and be judged. If you're believe in the Hindu Vedas, you're going to come back over and over again until you become enlightened. So it's these stories are the basic premise of our whole society. And the thing with fairy tales are that there's thousands and thousands of them. So the motifs and the symbols are easier to interpret because they're repeated over and over again. It's not like one story and that's it. So let me look at this right here. So the latest research on fairy tales, it was done by this Dr. Tarani and his colleagues. They traced back the languages and how they intersected the words and motifs, and they applied scientific techniques normally used by biologists and linguists to determine the age of fairy tales. They discovered that Jack and the Beanstalk, when the Eastern and Western Indo-European languages separated around 5,000 years ago, and while Beauty and the Beast and Rumpelstiltskin date back about 4,000 years. So they weren't written down, like I said, until the 1700s. So when you read something like the Grimm's fairy tales or Perrault's, you got to remember that there's thousands of variations. Like the classic fairy tales, like Cinderella, there's up to 1,000 different versions. So you can't really interpret it just by looking at one version. You have to put 5 or 6 of them together and see what they mean, what's repeated over and over again. One of the theories that on fairy tales and how they developed was that either they came from one place and they disseminated throughout the whole world, or they started all around the world from the collective imagination of humanity. And that's what I believe. There is proof that 1/3 of fairy tales came from India. And this is what the historian Joseph Jacobs says. He says 1/3 of the whole are derived from India. And that's due because their complex structure, their symbols, and the Brahmins were educated. You have to remember this is thousands of years ago. You know, India was much more educated and had Sanskrit language. That's one of the oldest languages in the world. So much of the ideas came from India, and that's where the spirit comes in, especially if 1/3 of fairy tales came in. And it went on, they had the Tantra, which was like 75 tales of fairy tales that were based on animals. They were like fables, but those were the most translated book in all of India. I mean, it made Sanskrit well known, in fact. But between that period, you're talking, there was an Italian, and then there was also some early Italian fairy tales and Latin, and those were copied later on in the 1700s by Charles Perrault, Mother Goose Tales, something like Little Red Riding Hood and Cinderella. They were more or less taken, not completely, but he edited a lot of the plots to coincide with the culture thought. And that's one of the big things in fairy tales, that each culture takes the basis of the fairy tale and adds their concepts to it, what they believe in. But the basic structure of the fairy tale has to stay the same, or else it just disappears. He edited the simple plots and he put elaborate language. And the whole thing about France at that time, that they shared fairy tales in these literary salons. In fact, that's when the name fairy tales came out. It wasn't, it's right here, conte de fées, I think. I'm not French, but that whole idea of the word fairy tale didn't come out to that period in the 1700s. And they looked at fairy tales, they changed them enough because they wanted fairy tales to teach morality to their children, and not so much the children, but just to you know, pull up the church's idea of morality. But fairy tales, basically, you can't even say they're moral. They're like they're about good and bad and how they intersect between each other and how you grow in consciousness. So basically, Jack Zeitz was a professor of German. He's wrote about 20 some books on fairy tales, over 20. And one of the things I really was interesting that he found that fairy tales are never written for children. This sort of shocked me in a way. They were written for adults, well, by adults, and for each other, for entertainment, for other reasons. They just sort of came up out of the cosmic consciousness and they entertained each other. But if you think about it like Jack and the Beanstalk, he steals the ogre's golden goose, the harp and the money, then he murders the ogre. I mean, do you show that to a child? Or Puss in Boots, the cat uses trickery to help his master obtain wealth and marriage. And Hansel and Gretel, you know, they're face cannibals. But the whole idea is, I'll show this later on, is so many fairy tales are spiritual in a sense that they're dealing with death and rebirth. And they're dealing with evil and the whole idea that your soul's immortal. So you have to overcome the limits of just one life, you might even say. So basically, my research has showed me that the plots and the symbolism and the motifs are just a dim reflection of our collective beliefs developed over thousands of years as an answer to our deepest religious questions about life's purpose relative to immortality, life and death, and the development of your personal identity. Jung, or Carl Jung, basically talks about development identity is the number one process, psychological process. So to understand some of these things, the fairy tales, you have to understand part of the Eastern religion and what they believe, because like I said, 1/3 of the fairy tales started in India and the other ones came from, I would say, our higher consciousness. And they were downloaded more or less. So the Indians and yoga think there's like 4 states of consciousness. The one's the ordinary waking state, the sleeping state, you know, deep sleep. And the last one, which the West really doesn't talk about that much, is enlightenment, where the psyche merges with the divine and they reach this state of bliss and immortality. So I'm going to skip over this, but Gopi Krishna, who he talks about how the mystical experience is activity of luminous form of thought energy, which bathes everything that's luster. So basically, when people say they're enlightened, most of them, there's very few who really experience this, where they actually see a light within themselves that's conscious. And it's, you might say, it's so blissful because they're merging with the divine. And that could be just temporarily for a minute or two, like a near-death experience. They see this light and they say it changes them. Well, the yogis have this experience where it can be permanent. And it's called enlightenment, self-realization. And he writes, the current confusion about the real nature of the mystical experience rests on the fact that there's no awareness that the biological factors responsible for this extraordinary state of cognition. As soon as it is confirmed by experiments that a transformation does occur in the brain and also in bioenergy, what fuels the thought, the speculation will be done. More or less what he's saying, that we should study the concept of Kundalini and how it actually changes your brain. And we can do this at this period now. It's not 10,000 years ago because we have different instruments. And there will be people in the future who enter this state, and they'll be able to not experiment on them, but notice the differences. You know, there'll be geniuses in music and art. So basically saying the human race has a destiny to reach a higher state of consciousness. And it's not something that you can ignore. So getting to the 10 motifs, they're built on a premise that there's a human desire to attain peace of mind or bliss through a journey to divine consciousness. So I approach the 10 motifs as something that the common trials that the psyche must encounter as it goes through life, as it develops as a personal identity. So the first one is a difficult conception. The second is that's when the parents in the fairy tales wish they had a certain type of child, like Cinderella, her parents wished that they had a child who is hair is black as ebony, lips is red, and white as snow. But that is symbolic of evolution, really. And the number one most ubiquitous of all the motifs is the missing parent. And I'll go through these in a second. The third is natural lifestyle. The natural lifestyle based, the missing parent is that there's like 27 fairy tales that are in Walt Disney. The mother is dead or dies, you know, or missing. And the father is just negligent, it's not there or missing. And the third is like a natural lifestyle, in a sense where a lot of the children, the protagonists, they move away from the castle that they've grown up, like Buddha, he moves away to stay out in nature, because it's the best way to live, to be close to nature. And as soon as they step on the path, like Little Red Riding Hood, the wolf appears, the adverse forces appear. They're the antagonistic. So it's sort of like, this is, as soon as you step on the spiritual path, the shadow comes and says, this is what you have to overcome. And for Little Red Riding Hood, that's the wolf. What actually the wolf represents death. And I'll go through that one. After that, a mentor, or sometimes they appear at the same time. A mentor appears to provide help. Like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. As soon as in the movie, as soon as the house lands, it kills her wicked witch, then Glenda, the good witch of the West, comes and hands her the shoes, which are another symbol. Well, shoes are a symbol of being on the path. So as say like Dorothy or whoever goes on their path back towards God, towards the divine, towards the wizard, you might say, they have to perform heroic deeds. You know, they're given all these different challenges. And that's just sort of odd. That's like almost every story has it. They have to overcome their lower forces. Like Hercules has 12 different labors he has to overcome. And usually to succeed, they have to conquer these adverse forces, solve riddles, everything else. But they all have spiritual ideas behind it. And once they achieve success, they return home with their gifts and their new higher consciousness. And they have to, I mean, it's sort of return home and help those who help them on their path. They return home to their parents for a while, or whoever helped them. So like Beauty and the Beast has to go back, and she gets the gold from the castle of the beast and helps her poor parents out. And at that time, right before the end, a spiritual transformation takes. Usually, this is like the beast becomes, and Beauty and the Beast, or the frog becomes a prince, and then they marry. The protagonist, if it's a woman or a man, they marry, and that's the sacred marriage. So it goes through all these 10 steps, which is interesting. They're in the classic fairy tales. They're all, you can see them. I broke them down, and it's amazing that maybe not all, if all of them are in there, if all 10 motifs are there, the fairy tales almost inevitably very famous. You know, it's because it hits our psyche at a deep level. So the difficult conception refers to basically the mother and the mother or father wishing to have a special type of child, and they're having difficulty. Like Rapunzel, they couldn't have a child, so they're praying all the time for one. This also happens in the Bible. It happens in other places. Little Snow White, the mother asks, "I wish I had a child who," like I repeat this again, you know, hair is black as ebony, face is white as snow, lips red. Well, those colors come up again and again. Black, white, and red are 3 colors of transformative colors. Because in alchemy, basically, everything starts out as polluted, as black. Like if you're creating elixir and you burn the ash, it starts out as black ashes. You run it through your operations, distill it, then it becomes white ashes, and finally becomes red ashes. In India, there's the 3 gunas, I think it's called. They are the same colors, black, white, and red. What red or gold is being the highest. So when they say, this is repeated over and over again in different fairy tales about the black, white, and red, that more or less symbolizes that they're talking about a transformation from the lowest form to the highest form. And that's the same thing in alchemy. It goes from the lowest form of lead to the highest form of gold. So the next motif that's almost in so many of these fairy tales is the missing parents. And the reason, I mean, there's so many reasons for this, but there's 5 basic ones. But if you think about it, Cinderella, her mother died at her birth. Little Snow White, the mother died. Beauty and the Beast is similar. Her mother died. Rapunzel, their parents didn't die, but she was given away to Dame Gothel, the enchantress. And so their parents are missing as they grow up. And this happens with Bambi. Pinocchio never had parents. Peter Pan, at 7 days old, he flies away. The Frog King, there's no mother. Hansel and Gretel, their mother died, and the stepmother more or less tries to kill them because they don't have enough food. Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz is an orphan. So all these ideas, what's this missing parent about? It also happens in mythology. There's more than one explanation, but I go by the idea that you might say the child, which is really the soul, has to be free from the parent's karma, and they have to go out and face the world and develop their own personal psyche, their own personal way of dealing with reality. And it's Jung calls it individuation. To be a mature and psychologically healthy person, you have to face problems by yourself, and you can't depend on your parents all the time. And even something like Bambi, it's going to happen anyways in the future. Your parents are going to pass away as you get older. So the whole idea of missing parents, it's the concept that each life, your parents are there just temporarily, and you have to depend on God or the divine to develop. That's one way. And also there's other ways too. When the parents are missing, the children have very difficult time. Like Little Red Riding Hood, her father wasn't there. Now, if the father was there, the wolf literally eats her. But if the father was there, would he have protected her? But a lot of times, some other person comes around, like the huntsman comes to save them. So you have to look at fairy tales as the characters surrounding the main protagonist are parts of the psyche. So there's a female part and there's a masculine part, the anima and animus. And a lot of times they're projected on to the person. And if they're missing, that means the protagonists themselves, like Little Red Riding Hood, doesn't have a masculine sort of model to follow, or Little Snow White, her mother died, so she doesn't have any type of mentor who's to show her how to mature from. And what she does have is like a negative stepmother. So basically, that's part of Little Snow White's problem. She has to become conscious of how to be feminine and how to use the yin energy and the masculine energy, because the father lets the stepmother almost kill her. There's 3 attempts of her life on Little Snow White. Now, simple. So that starts off most of fairy tales. That's when the parents are missing, and then the negative protagonist comes, and then a lot of times they have to live a simple lifestyle. That means they move away from their castle and they have to live somewhere out in a cottage somewhere, like Little Snow White she moves away from her castle, and she has to live somewhere in she lives with the 7 dwarfs. The 7 dwarfs are really the 7 chakras. They're the parts that connect her with reality. And Gopinakrishnan talks about this idea of a simple life. This law demands is that people should lead a peaceful, moderate, and harmonious life according to principles that are good for others and society. There should be no exploitation, no aggression, no action, or thought of any way of the welfare of hurting other people, you might say. So in the fairy tales, or like in Buddha, he moves away from being a king to go live out in the country. And that's the same with Beauty and the Beast. Her father loses his fortune. They move to a small farm. Little Snow White, the father's remarries, and the stepmother tries to kill Little Snow White, and she has to move into the middle of the forest with the 7 dwarfs. Cinderella, whose father was very rich, he ignores her. Her mother dies, and she has to tend to live a simple life of helping other people. So after all that, as soon as they step on the path to higher consciousness, negative beings show up and try to persuade them not to follow the path towards God. I mean, that's their challenge. In the fairy tales, that's presented by all these, wolves that want to eat you, as example, Little Red Riding, she has no father. As soon as she steps on the path, the wolf appears, but she has no personality. You might say the psyche hasn't developed yet. So she's very naive, and the wolf convinces her, instead of going directly to the grandmother's house and delivering food and wine because her grandmother's sick, the wolf convinces Little Red Riding Hood to pick flowers and just fool around. Well, he's given the directions to the house, and he runs right to the house and eats her grandmother up. But the thing is, what's really chasing Little Red Riding Hood is death. She's on the path, and she only has so much time to become a better person. And that's the whole idea. Our Bruno Bettelheim, who's a psychologist, says you have to choose between pleasure or what's right for this particular life. Anyways, it's interesting when she gets to the Little Red Riding Hood, gets to grandmother's house, the wolf is disguised as the grandmother, and he asks her to get in bed with her. And then she notices the questions. She asks him these questions. How big are, what big ears you have? And that has to do with hearing. And what big eyes you have, talking to the wolf. That has to do with seeing. All the questions have to do with the five senses. So the whole idea here is that she's waking up, she's becoming conscious of the material world and how it's an illusion. So the wolf represents death and is coming closer to her. And just as she recognizes that it's an illusion, she's swallowed up and dies. But this is the other part that people don't really understand of the fairy tales. She doesn't die because the huntsman comes and cuts open her stomach, cuts open the wolf's stomach, and takes out Little Red Riding Hood and takes out the grandmother. Now, this relates to the myth of Cronus. Cronus is the same way. Cronus was, the Greek gods. The first god was Uranus, and the second god was Cronus. He birthed the first 5 titans, like Poseidon. They were the brothers of Zeus. Zeus was the last one. He ate every one. He swallowed them. Now, Kronos relates to time, and time is always chasing everybody, just as death is always chasing everybody. So the whole idea is death is chasing them, is going to swallow them up. But the soul is immortal. So Zeus came back, he got saved, basically, but he tricked Kronos, and he made Kronos throw up all of his brothers and sisters. Then they had the big war of the Titans. Anyways, Kronos actually is symbolized by the wolf also. It's time and death. He's the Grim Reaper. But the huntsman comes back and they're saved. So basically the whole idea is the soul is immortal and it can't be killed. And that's the quickest way to the basic theme is the psyche, Little Red, loss of divine consciousness. She loses her God consciousness. She's incarnated into matter. She just realizes it when she asks all these questions, but she dies again. But not really, because she's saved by the huntsman. So on the path, you always come across a mentor. Just as there's an antagonist, there's a mentor. It's like they say the fairy godmother, but that's only something that Walt Disney and the Grimms put in. A lot of time the mentors are all sorts of different things. Sometimes they're a tree. And in the fairy tale of Cinderella, it's the actual one from the oldest versions of the 1700s. It's a tree that gives her the dresses and the shoes. It's not a fairy godmother. And there's no pumpkin, more or less. So the tree actually is symbolic of the human spine. And that's through all the different myths. Christ dies on a tree. Did you know that Odin hung on a tree for 9 days till his eye became single? And all sorts of concepts were like that. The tree appears over and over again. There's another one. The Buddha became enlightened underneath the tree. Well, the tree stands for your spine and your spinal column and your brain, and the whole idea of the snake rising through the column into your brain. That's even in the story of Adam and Eve. There's the snake, there's the tree, there's the apple. That's the whole idea of becoming enlightened and becoming, knowing the difference between good and evil. So after they get to a certain point, they're given certain deeds or problems or even some sort of question. They're given a riddle that they have to solve. And that also basically, Sleeping Beauty has to go through a dangerous forest, more or less. She's in a dangerous forest, and the prince has to go through it to find Sleeping Beauty. And in actuality, Sleeping Beauty is the prince's inner feminine that he has to find. So he has to go through the forest, which is the unconscious. And most of the time, you see a forest, that has to do with the unconscious too. And same with water. Like Pinocchio, his father is stuck in a whale underwater, or Noah, same with Noah, and the ark. The water represents the unconsciousness that we have to come out of. So the seventh, more or less, motif is on the path to enlightenment. You have to conquer evil forces and beings, and those are the same ones that are inside you. They're projected outward. In the Seven Ravens, which is a fairy tale, that this young woman has to search all around the world for her 7 brothers who were turned into ravens. And the whole idea here is that she became enlightened, and she has to come back down, bring that energy back down to earth. And she has to conquer a wicked witch, and she has to go through all these different trials and tribulations. Same with Psyche and Cupid. They attain a high state, but then it's not kept. But they have to go through other trials to keep that state of awareness. So finally, after they reach the state, they have to return home to balance their karma, and they give their gifts, what they have received in higher consciousness. A lot of times this is gold or silver, but that's just an expression of what they have attained, and they help their parents out. This is sort of like you reach a high state, then you go back into the world to raise the world back up. And finally, there's a spiritual transformation which takes place. And this is more or less, first you're initiated by fire, a baptism of fire, and then a baptism of water. And this is more or less the cleansing of your spiritual bodies. First, Kundalini cleanses all your nervous system, and then the prana is able to circulate and can reach a higher state. And after that, there's a cleansing of water, which is really symbolized by baptism. And finally, there's a sacred marriage. All the fairy tales seem to end in a sacred marriage. It's the male and female, because the ancients used to think that people, the very beginning when they were born, they were androgynous or hermaphrodite, so that when they came down to earth, they were either a male or a female, and they had to retrace their steps and develop the inner male and inner female. And then when there's a sacred marriage, they would attain a higher consciousness that they had before they came to earth. So like the Rosicrucians believed in a universal androgen or universal hermaphrodite, which stated a perfect merging of the sexes predated the current corrupted world and would eventually lead to a utopia in the future. And that's shown in the fairy tales as the sacred marriage that ends basically most of fairy tales. So I'll just go over these 5 symbols. One of the serpent is a symbol of Kundalini, and that's how come you see it in so many different myths and fairy tales, and in the Bible and everything. This is the feminine energy, and it raises upwards from the earth, and it wakes you up to a higher state. And as it goes up the tree is your spine or your nervous system. And then see, like in the Garden of Eden, they eat it. It's not really apple, but they eat the fruit of the tree. Well, the fruit of the tree is the fruit of higher consciousness. It's experienced in the brain, in the cave of Brahm or eye of Horus. It's the same thing. If you cut an apple in half and look at it, it looks just like the cave of Brahman or eye of Horus. There's a center there with a little seed sticking out that's like your pineal gland, and that's like a pine cone. It looks just like that, and that's how come they use an apple to symbolize it. And that goes back 2,000-3,000 years before the Bible and other myths. Well, I wouldn't say myths, but sacred text, because in Greek mythology, there's the Garden of Hesperides, where Hercules has to attain the golden apples of immortality. And he has to conquer Landon, which is a 100-headed serpent, to attain that. So the same idea is throughout the world in different myths. And the virgin birth is basically the raising of Kundalini through the sublimation of circular sexual energy. But you circulate your energy. So when they say the virgin birth, it has many different meanings. It just doesn't mean that they were born originally by a virgin. So take like the myth of Krishna. Krishna had like 6 brothers and sisters, yet when he was born, they considered him a virgin. Or just like Horus was born of the Virgin Isis. But the whole idea it's a spiritual birth. It's not the physical birth. And the same with death and resurrection. It's a symbolized in all the fairy tales. These are psychological. Maybe in the future it is a physical restructuring of the bodies that will, you'll be able to live for thousands of years or something, because we're evolving. So I mean, I'll go real quick through like a little Snow White now, and look at the motifs here. The first one is a difficult conception. The mother wishes that she had a child, so they were having a hard time, conceiving. So she wants a child who's, like I already mentioned that twice. So that's the whole idea of the child is the growth of a higher self. It's not really a small little person, you might say. The missing parent. Well, Snow White's mother dies, and the father is completely unconcerned about what their evil stepmother tries to kill her 3 times. Natural lifestyle. Well, Snow White has to leave their castle. She has to live in the forest with the 7 dwarfs who teach her how to live simply, just cooking and taking care of them and doing other things. It's a natural lifestyle. She has to leave, like I said, any castle. The antagonist is the Wicked Queen, of course, a personification of Snow White's unconscious complexes. It's showing that as the psyche grows, she has to overcome all the negative attributes of the wicked queen. The seven dwarfs are like the seven chakras. They're lower. Little Snow White represents the highest chakra, but she has to ground that energy into the earth, and the seven dwarfs work in the earth. They work in the caves. They look for gold. So they're teaching her more or less as mentors. And she performs heroic deeds. That's the sixth, or by running through the forest and basically just staying alive in a sense. She's tempted 3 times. And this is interesting because it has to do with beauty, in a sense that the wicked queen is always asking who's the most beautiful of all, and little Snow White falls 3 times because she's attempted 3 times with things that are beautiful. The first one is with a corset, and it's tied so tight that she almost dies. The second time, the wicked queen gives her a comb that's poisoned. And then the third time, the dwarf save her, but the third time, she's given a apple, just like Adam and Eve, and she dies from that. But that whole idea is that she reached higher consciousness and her old self dies. Anyway, the prince comes and saves her, and finally the sacred marriage occurs. So before I go any further, it's already 8 o'clock. So I'm just gonna stop here and see if there's any questions, or anybody wants to ask anything.
I'll ask a quick question.
Sure.
I'm wondering, like, how did you get started, like, on this investigating fairy tales, like, adventure that you're on, this, like, journey? You said you were out in Nevada near Reno, but like,
Yeah.
like, what was it, like, what sparked all this for you?
Well, I wanted to write on Kundalini, but I just didn't want to repeat what everybody else said. And Gopi Krishna said to study Kundalini. He has a book on it about how all the different myths and religions have different concepts that are related to it. So I spent about a year or so looking into religions, and I wrote over 100,000 words on it. And I know about, like, Mithra and Kabbalah, the Great Mother. And then one day I was looking at the fairy tales. I said, God, the fairy tales are even clearer. I mean, there's thousands of them, and they're just so clear. And that's what one of the Jungian psychologists, Maria Louise, talked about. She said fairy tales are the clearest form of archetypes that we can study that will show what human nature is. So I started looking through one, and it just got deeper and deeper and deeper. It's like what Jordan Peterson says. It's like it's another side. It almost trains another side of your brain to look at things from a different point of view. And the other part that was really made a big difference, I've been an artist for 40, 50 years. So I've always been visual. So when they say, look at different things like water and the snake, and people are, left brain, it's always through words. I'm looking at things through colors. I have a whole thing on the different colors and how each color relates to a different state of consciousness. And it's in the fairy tales, but nobody sees it. But I think my artistic background has really helped me. So it's almost like you said, it's like a search. People don't think, I don't know, you have to get deeper into it to really understand what I'm trying to do. And I have a little bit of autism. I'm not the greatest talker, I try to get my ideas across, but I'm not a Jordan Peterson or anything. But that's how come it's taken me such a long time to write the book. I took lessons, I took and that sort of thing. I went to some writing places. But
It's really awesome. I appreciate you sharing.
thanks. Anything, anybody?
It makes me wonder how much fairy tales that when a person was young, spent a lot of time with, and how much that could affect their development over the years, as much as development from other sources. I listened to 78 records of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and
Oh,
of,
yeah.
of Cinderella many, many times when I was 3 and 4 years old. And I can still remember even the music behind those, some of those 78, you know, Tchaikovsky and so forth. But I remember those albums, and I wonder, you know, how much effect those had on me as I grew up.
Well, in my book, it's sort of interesting because fairy tales were never made for children. I think it's some of the forces, some of the unconscious unconscious things that happen to people as children are written in fairy tales. And they can't, adults can't figure it out directly, so they put it into fairy tales. You know, there's cannibalism, there's sexual incest, there's abuse, but at the same time, that's sort of balanced with the concept that you can move towards enlightenment. If so, there's the worst of the human race and the best. And I think if a person studies fairy tales, if you get stuck in religious, you know, in religions, I think you should study fairy tales. I mean, it helps you understand how the abstract concepts are brought down into the physical world. Yeah, the fairy tales do affect you, but sometimes, you know, I wonder, do you want to teach children? You know, some of the early psychologists said fairy tales teach children morality, but I don't think they do. I think they're for grown-ups, and they're teaching grown-ups how to deal with trauma and how to deal with life, because they were written for adults, and adults always read them to children. A child never wrote a fairy tale. There's never, they just don't write fairy tales. You know, they're not into cannibalism or whatever it is. You know, they're not into that stuff. But it's life, you know. It's the parents die. It's part of the process. But you know, it's really interesting that some of the things I discovered.
Yeah, Joseph, did you study Clarissa Pinkola Estes' books, especially the one, Women Who Run with the Wolves?
No, I haven't. I've been studying really the standard PhDs like Zeitz and Bruno Bettelheim and Jungian. I've heard of that book, but I never had a chance to read it. I mean, I would love to.
Well, yeah, because she deals in here with the various fairy tales and goes into the in-depth analysis of the psychology.
What does she say? Can you repeat any of it? Have it
well, I mean, this is how thick the book is. Okay.
Okay.
You know, there's a whole bunch in here, but in this, her particular message here is talking about the wild woman and how to basically get back to nature and how to, again, as you were talking, bring back the masculine and the feminine energies both up and have them equal in the individual. And for instance, in Bluebeard, here are the different parts that she has in here about the natural predator of the psyche, naive women as prey, the
Yeah.
key to knowing the importance of snuffing, the animal groom, blood scent, backtracking and looping, giving the cry, the sin eaters, dark man in women's dreams. So so she goes into a lot of detail on the various story. Now, the doll in her pocket, Vasilisa, is another one of the Hansel and Gretel variations. So there's a lot in here, and it goes into a lot of the explanations of how your psyche works and what all of this really means. And I agree with you. Fairy tales were not written for children.
Okay.
I think what you're doing, Joe, is fantastic. It's really exciting, and I hope is your book published yet, or?
No, I'm aiming for the end of the year. I have to do footnotes, bibliography, some illustrations, and I'm still rewriting some things so it's clear. It's
The one of the members of the Theosophical Society, Robert Elwood, wrote a book on the spiritual meaning of, I think it's Star Wars, and which is a quest book, really interesting. And I don't know if everybody knows this, but The Wizard of Oz was written by a member of the Theosophical Society, Frank Baum. And he, there have been articles written about the spiritual meaning of all the characters in The Wizard of Oz. And Frank Baum intentionally used these spiritual ideas that you're referring to, and the meaning of as you mentioned, Dorothy being an orphan, and he purposely arranged it to give Wizard of Oz this deep spiritual meaning, and he wrote it for children, but it's become such a classic and has so much meaning to it that we all, I watch it every chance it's on, every time it's on TV.
well, that's interesting because I'd like to do a whole article on that. Yeah, I mean, it has all the 10 motifs. It's really interesting. She's an orphan. She steps on the path. Think about the winding road in the movie, The Golden Road. First thing she meets is the evil witch, and she kills him. The house falls on the evil witch. Then Glenda, the good witch, is there. So the mentor's there. She starts on the path. She goes through the forest. The forest represents the unconscious. It's in all the myths. Everything happens in the forest, like little Snow White goes in the forest with the 7 dwarfs. The three in the book's even more interesting because there's so many things in the book that aren't in the movie. Shoes I didn't get to it, but the shoes are a big symbol in all the myths. They represent being on a path. If you lose one shoe, it means you're on the wrong path. If you Cinderella,
Or it means you're not fully prepared to walk the path, and that's
right.
a symbol that comes from the Masonic tradition.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it's even more ancient than that. The Masons drew on it, put it in their ritual as a symbol, but it's an ancient, very ancient symbol of not being quite ready.
Well, in my book on Cinderella, I trace it back. There's an old Greek myth about, actually it's Greco-Persian or something, about a king that an eagle, this young maiden lost her shoe, and an eagle takes it and drops the shoe on the king's lap, and he goes looking for it everywhere, just like Cinderella. And once he finds it, they marry. But the whole idea is she's on the path to going inward and finding her king within. And once they do, they get that turns to the sacred marriage. And Cinderella, she starts off you know, helping her sister. She has wooden shoes. By the end, she has the golden shoes and she marries the prince. So it's repeated over and over again. There's a whole bunch of things about shoes. You know, you get married, you tie shoes to the back of the bumper because you're on a new path. You know, they throw roses over when you get married. They used to throw rose over. Well, before it used to be a shoe. They used to throw a shoe over your to the group of people to see who would get married next. And so, I mean, the symbolism is very interesting. It goes on and on.
Yeah, fascinating.
I have
Yeah.
a question about shoes. What about the red shoes story, where she gets red shoes, red supposedly being the highest part of consciousness, and has them on her feet, but then they take over her life and effectively destroy her? Does that mean she just wasn't
mean-
ready
You mean
to take
Cinderella?
on the red shoes story?
I haven't read that. I'm sorry.
That's, well, that what happens in that particular story is that she is a ballerina dancer. She wants to be a dancer, and somebody gives her a pair of red shoes to wear, ballerina shoes.
Mhm.
And when she puts them on, she can't stop dancing.
You
And
know
then
what
she can't take them off, and it ultimately kills her.
that means she's not ready for higher consciousness.
Yeah, okay,
It was too much of an experience.
yeah.
There's people who get that, and it drives them nuts.
Mhm.
They
I
can't
think
come back.
what I read
back
that
down to
she
earth.
had the red shoes. She made a choice between the life of her, like using the money or the gift to help her mom or her parents or something, rather than buy the shoes. I don't remember exactly, but it was a choice she made. So
Okay.
she chose the you know, the glamour kind of thing rather than the heartfelt.
Okay.
And I think
Right.
that's why she danced forever.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
that makes sense.
it would be equivalent then to raising the Kundalini energy before you're ready to really handle it.
Or just making like Little Red Riding Hood, she made a choice to pick flowers instead of help her grandmother out and give her food, and she got killed,
Mhm.
you know? So it's like a choice. Well, Bruno Bettelheim talks a lot about the choice between pleasure and duty.
Mhm.
And so that's a big theme in all the fairy tales too.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
But Yeah.
Shannon had a question. She raised her hand. She just put it down. Shannon?
Hi. Oh, thank you. I was just curious. I'm really fascinated and appreciate you sharing what you're sharing and doing. I'm kind of curious as you've been delving into these fairy tales and myths, what has been your favorite one? Is there one that really was really wowed you, or one that just really stands out for you?
I actually like Iron John a lot. And it's not in the book. I took it out. Well, I didn't take it out. The book is 270 pages, and I had to drop 2 or 3 fairy tales. It was getting too complicated. It's complicated as it is. But I liked Iron John because, well, for one, it's a masculine sort of. It's a little boy, and he has a golden ball, and it represents consciousness. But Iron John is this young boy who becomes a man, but his mentor is this wild man who lives underneath a lake, and he's really basically a prince too, and he helps Iron John go through life. Yeah, you should read it. It was a big controversy at one time, 10 years ago. Robert Bly, who's a poet, wrote it, and he put all these different ideas, concepts about modern society, and all the fairy tale scholars think he's nuts. And I see a whole different concept to it. But if you read, I have a blog. It's called Mythic Spiral. I think there's a link to it. I have a blog article on that. So that's my favorite one.
Yeah, the link is in the chat.
You want to have a question?
Yeah, I have a comment about the point that was raised as to what the effect of these fairy tales would be on children. I think the esoteric meanings that we've been talking about would be lost on children typically, except perhaps on a subliminal level. But I think they do have a kind of life purpose anyway in simply illustrating the extremities of life, the powers of good and evil, etc. So they serve a purpose in that way if it isn't on a metaphysical level.
Yeah, I would agree. It so much fairy tales are hitting your psyche from a different point of view, even a child's psyche. But like I said, it's grown-ups who wrote them and grown-ups who read them and everything else. And what I've noticed, which is interesting, the most famous fairy tales have all the 10 motifs. If they only have one or two, they're not that well known. So what I think I discovered is like they're famous because they're affecting us on a deeper level than a regular story. You know, how many millions of stories have been written over the years and they disappear after a month or a year? You know, we don't read stories that were 5,000 years old. They just, the language is even different. I mean, but the ones that are fairy just keep repeating over and over. Look at Disney. They're making billions off the same concepts over and over. Now, in my book, on the first chapter, I get right into the three greatest, not three greatest, but some of the major movies recently: Star Wars, Avatar, and The Matrix. They all have the same. Star Wars is the idea of how consciousness works in reality. You know, consciousness over matter, the Force. And The Matrix is about death and resurrection. The whole story, it's like a Christ. You know, Neo at the end resurrects, and it's a fake world. It's an illusionary world. And Avatar is the same thing. Consciousness isn't structured just on the physical body. He can move to another body and experience a whole nother reality. So, I mean, those three are famous movies, and they're based on spiritual themes. So, I mean, like I said in the very beginning, like Plato said, the people who write stories rule the world. And one of the reasons I'm really getting deep into the fairy tales is because I want to take those symbolisms and do a book on the different religions and show how they're similar. And they're basically based on the idea of the evolution of consciousness, you know, coming closer to the divine and understanding your own immortality. And instead you won't, I mean, you think about Afghanistan, they've been at war for how long? All the million. I always knew they're never going to solve a war, a spiritual war with bullets. This you have to convince people that what's the similarities between religions. You know, everybody deep down knows that there's, you know, a religion is supposed to bring people together, not separate them. And the politicians and everything, they use that to divide people. I want to use this sort of research to bring all the concepts together. Anything else?
Yeah, this is, like you say, it's like there's always a lesson. It almost seems like it all started with a feeling, and then you want to relate that feeling to someone. So then you've got to put it into a lesson, and you can't make it too personal, otherwise other people can't relate to it. But like you say, the Disney stuff and those fairy tales, I never understood why they would make me cry like a baby. I guess I could feel it. I just couldn't understand it. And now I'm starting to understand why I was crying. So now I'm starting to understand the story. I was all lost in the emotions. I was the same with music. I could never hear the words. Just the music overtook me.
Yeah. Well, it's fairy tales are very deep, even though they're like
Yeah.
they're a bunch of fairies, you know. But,
Well, like you say, there's no way they were for kids. It was me to you, a little less personal, a little more entertaining.
and what's interesting, getting back to the Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Now he said he wrote that for children, but all the 10 motifs are in there, and these fairy tales have happened throughout the whole world. They all have the same ideas, and it's almost impossible for people to copy the same one over and over again. By the time it got 1,000 years ago, it would change. The only way you can think about it is that it's being downloaded from a higher consciousness, a collective consciousness, that these themes are so incised within our awareness that everybody knows them, but they can't put the words on them, so it comes out in a fairy tale.
Yeah. Yep.
And getting back to the Wizard of Oz. Now the three people, was the lion that followed Dorothy, are aspects of our own self. You know, one's it's spirit, one's mental, and one's the heart. So like the was it the Tin Man who wanted a heart, and then the lion wanted courage.
You want the heart, yeah. And then the brain was the Tin Man.
Yeah, the brain was the Tin Man. No, no, it was, yeah. But anyways, the whole idea is that those.
Brain was the straw man.
Yeah, there
Right.
you go. There you go. The three of those things, just like all the characters in fairy tales, are within Dorothy herself. Just like the shoe, she always had the power to go home, and she always had those three attributes of the intellect and the heart and everything. But she has to go through the experience. And walking through the forest is the unconscious, you know. And in the book, they meet these monsters that they have to conquer. And they have to cross over water, which is, there's a big river and there's no way to get over it. But Dorothy, I think there's some sort of monster chasing them. But they pass over it, which is like passing over baptism by water. And it's pretty interesting. And the wizard himself, like so many other ones, she thinks that somebody on Earth, the wizard would be like her father. She's an orphan. She's looking for her father to save her and bring her home. But the reality is she always had that in herself, and home is divine consciousness, you know. And she sees that the father in the real world is just fake. He's just using technology. It's like old fairy tales wouldn't use technology. But in the wizard, because it's newer, you've seen that the technology, we're just fooled, just like by TV and film, you're fooled. So it's interesting. Yeah, there is one different symbols in the fairy tales that also relate to mythology. Like the tree is really interesting. You know, Adam and Eve, the tree, the serpent, the fall. Now the fall really is that they reached higher consciousness. As soon as you reach higher consciousness, you have to bring it back down into the earth plane. So all the forces, all the negative forces rebel against you. And so they have to struggle through, you know, suffering on earth. That's the human race. And what was it? The old man and the one, well, there's one fairy tale where the daughter, the frog king, she's tossing a golden ball up and down, and it falls into the well, and only person, that's her favorite toy, and she's crying and everything. So the frog says that he'll bring it back if he can sleep with her and go up to the castle and everything. And the same thing happens in Iron John. The little boy has a ball, a golden ball, and it falls into the Iron Man's cage, Iron John's cage, and he won't give it back unless Iron John gets the key to the cage and sets him free. But the key is underneath the mother's pillow, his mother's pillow. So the key to going forward is understanding his inner feminine. But the idea of the golden ball is tossing it up and tossing it down. It falls into the well. The well is then the golden ball is your consciousness. It goes up into the higher realms and it comes back down into earth, into the unconscious. And it circulates. And Taoism is circulation of the light. So when now the psychologists they look at it totally from the culture. Like Zeitz says, the golden ball, is simply the aristocratic class being so rich that they don't have any regard for money, and they're tossing a golden ball up and down, and it falls and disappears. So it's basically trying to, the concept is that they're trying to subjugate the young maiden to patriarchal society and make her basically accept it in the future, But for me, it's entirely different. I don't want to explain it right, but I'm on a different level than the cultural level. There is a culture there, and there is, but it's only one part of the fairy tale.
Joe, you mentioned the symbolism of color, and I was just wondering, I don't know if I caught that you did talk about it, but could you talk about the color red and what that signifies?
Well, there's a sequence of colors. I call them the transformative colors. It starts off with black, goes to white, then they're in alchemy too. Then it goes to red, and finally the gold. And those, in alchemy, they even have different names for these. The black is the period of blackening, where your consciousness first starts to become purified, and it becomes, what do they call it? It's not purified, but it starts to degrade. Everything becomes black. It's the dark night of the soul. That's when you start out on your path. And after you get past that, it's distilled with water, and it becomes more pure, and then the ashes become white. This is if you do a herb. But there's also, they call it the white phase. Now, Gopi Krishna had experience, this sort of happened to me too, the Kundalini rising, and afterwards, there was like a white film on everything that I looked at. It was like this sort of looking through a veil. Everything was white, like the light was brighter. And alchemy, they called it the white phase. It lasted for a while. And then finally, the red phase is when you're purified to the highest extent. But that even goes further. It turns to gold. So like in alchemy again, you have the minerals. It starts off with lead. Lead is the most polluted of the minerals. It's represented by Kronos, the wolf. It's death, represented by Saturn. The square, it's material world. And then it goes up to all through the 7 metals. There's like Jupiter, which is tin, then Mars, which is iron, Mercury, Quicksilver, the moon. The moon is silver. Then there's Quicksilver, which is Mercury, and then there's gold. And each one is supposed to be, there's a male and female in each of the metals. The male is the yang energy, and it's sulfur, and the female is Mercury, and that's silver. So each of these things have different colors. Copper, which silver, of course, is silver, but represents the moon. So when you see anything of these colors within fairy tales, you can relate it to one of the planets and where the person is. If it's black in a sense that they're being purified. If it's silver, it means they're almost they're or white. They're close to the moon period. You know, that's the feminine energy. Actually black, according to this thing in Tamil, black is the feminine. Black and blue are feminine energies. Your bottom chakras are not red; they're black and blue, according to Tamil. And the next one, your third one, which is black, is the physical world, because the mother, you know, the mother is from the physical, Mother Earth. And on top of that sits water. Water is feminine too, and that's blue. So that's your second chakra. Your third one, which is green, that's all the greenery that sits on the earth. That's your third chakra. And on top of that, from green, it switches over and it goes to like orange, which is your throat. Actually, no, it goes to red, because that's your heart. Your heart, instead of the chakra system here, is your heart is green. Actually, according to the meal, your heart is red. In all the visuals, that's what it is. And above that is orange. That's your throat. You know, your thyroid is orange. And then the color of your third eye is sort of violet. And up at the very top is your top chakras are transparent. You don't even see it. There's the violets and the chartreuses and all the very subtle colors on the higher chakras. So they get into that in the Tamil language, which is southern India, and that's as old as Sanskrit. That's the oldest language in the world, really. Those two. But I go by those colors of the chakras, and they're not in the fairy tales are basically the full transformative colors. You can see those if you read more or less the Arthurian romances. There's also fairy tales that come out and say black, white, and red. You know, I wish so and so. They always are related to like a marriage sometimes. I mean, does it help at all?
Could I steer the question? Because I'm curious about the same thing. You know, can we talk about like why the little Red Riding Hood is red? Is that,
Yeah.
like, what's up with that? Because I don't see the connection. I am curious.
Well, I put down in my book, she has a red cape. Okay. She had black shoes. So you get black, red, and usually she's got a white blouse. So those are the three transformative colors. But the real proof is there's another fairy tale called The Real Fairy Tale of Little Red Riding Hood by, I don't have it off the top of my head, but she wears a golden cape. And when the wolf goes to jump on her and eat her, he burns his mouth and runs away. So that's he says that's the real story of Little Red Riding, the Red Riding Hood. So the whole idea, she pushes death away because she has reached a higher state of immortality, of consciousness. She's wearing a golden cape, you know. And red has a lot to do with blood, you know, how blood saves people and everything, and Christianity and the blood of the new covenant carries the life force. But gold is the highest, and esoteric Aurobindo, and what he talks about, the highest ether, which is in the cells of the body, which he says is coming down into the earth plane, that's golden color. And that's going to more or less, as our mind takes a back step and becomes quieter, this golden light that's in the cells of our body is going to be able to keep us healthy. It's going to create miracles. It's, you know, evolution never stays the same. We're changing. There's going to be new types of young people who are born that we will rebel against the old, just like the prophecies, you know. The prophecy Cronus is given that his son is going to overthrow him. Well, that's what's happening right now. The young kids whatever you want to call them, indigo kids, whatever. What we have achieved, it's going to be given to them already. It's in their DNA already. See what I'm saying? So everything looks so bad. I think it's just a reaction to the high energy that's coming down into the earth plane. It's as soon as you step on the path, the antagonist appears. So what's appearing? No system is working. Our government's not working. Everybody's staying at home. There's no money. That the earth is dying. Well, that's what we have to overcome. It's that simple. If we don't do it, our children will, or a new race of beings will. That, they're not stuck on conservative or liberal. They're not stuck on these opposites. It's a non-dual. They'll say, well, here's the solution. It doesn't satisfy anybody, but it works.
Okay.
I just want to mention, in the interest of referring to color symbolism, there's a good song in Les Miserables called Red and Black, which is not esoteric. It has some of the more mundane, commonplace references to color symbolism, but it's a good song. You might want to listen to it just because it's a good song.
I listen to a lot of music. Yeah.
Well, any final questions for Joe before I say a couple things to kind of close us up?
So this is Kenny. Yeah, I come in late because I'm doing a 7-week course in person at a yoga studio on astrology, alchemy, archetypes, and the planets. And Joe, wish I could have been here earlier, but wow, even the last part was amazing. And
thank you.
I did perfectly and expanded upon what we were studying. So thank you for that.
Great. Yeah. I have a.
And Sandy, just so you know, Sandy, yes from Valerie for being a speaker.
Thank you. Great. We'll connect later. Thanks so much.
So thanks, Joe, and everybody.
You're welcome.
I have a comment, and I wanted to thank Joe for bringing up the current chaos in the world and relating it to this whole idea of the new energies coming down and the antagonists that are there, because more and more people are actually stepping on the path, and that helps make things a little more clear in my mind about acceptance of what's happening, because it's been hard. But I thank you for that. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Well, thank everybody for listening. Trying my best.
Thank you. That was spectacular, Joe.
Yeah, really.
The depth that you go into is really special. I mean, really, I said it in the beginning, we can refer to people that we've read, but we've never gotten to, most of us, I think, to actually speak to somebody who's done the research firsthand and not done it by secondhand research. And that's really what it really shows in what you gave us today. And we're all looking forward to the book. And of course, since you're connected to the Theosophical Society, when that book gets published, you'll communicate that with us, and maybe we can carry it in our bookstore, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So actually, Randy, if you don't mind sharing the YouTube channel in the chat, just so everyone has it. Nancy asked if this will be up, and I think it usually takes about a couple weeks to get it up, but it will be on the YouTube channel. So if you're not already subscribed, please do. And then hit the bell so that you can get alerted when it does get posted up. Lots of rich information here today. A reminder, if you'd like to send the lodge a donation, we usually ask for about $5 if you can or more. There's some links put up there as well in the chat box, and maybe Randy can copy paste it again so that you have it towards the bottom. And then I just want to let you know about some things happening, but I didn't, it's the one thing I regret about Zoom is that I can't do the thing at the end, which is like, thank you so much, Joseph, for being here. And then we all give you a round of applause. So why don't we show our hands for those with the camera? Thank you for being here, really. It was a pleasure, and we hope to have you back whenever you would like to share more with us. So
Sure.
thank you for that. So I just want to let you know about next week's next week already. Our program is with Andre Kluel, and he's talked with us before, and he's a lot of fun. He's going to be talking about, I think, directly about the evolution of consciousness. And I had it, but I always have 200 windows open. Now I can't find it. But basically, he makes sure that we all know it's a lighthearted approach. So that's going to be fun. Here it is, actually. He always gives us a nice little fun, lighthearted time. So a lighthearted look at some of the heavy mysteries, a natural history of consciousness is the title of it. And he's a national speaker with the Theosophical Society in America. So every so often we get speakers from them. We will have many more in 2022, but everybody's booked right now because of Zoom. So, but we have about 3 or 4 lined up for next year. So his question is, what is consciousness? What is the relationship of consciousness to spirit? How do scientists conceive of consciousness? What do clairvoyants tell us about consciousness? How is consciousness related to dreams and deeper levels of sleep? What is unconsciousness? Are plants conscious? Did the universe originate from consciousness? This discussion aims to raise your theological consciousness regarding these mysteries. Some deep, heavy questions. And again, we'll do it with some fun and lightheartedness. So am I missing anything? We do have more things coming, but please, I don't have it listed now, so just keep your eyes open for future programs. Anything I'm missing though?
I just want to point out that the Theosophical Society in Detroit is a membership organization. So if this kind of talk was interesting to you, any of the people who are new here, we do have events like this all the time. And we're part of, as Sandy mentioned at the beginning, we're part of an international network of other lodges that are all doing this kind of thing. So if you're looking for a community, this is one. And yeah, we're going to be meeting in person again, doing member only meetings in the building. So it's worth knowing that. Joe, I really appreciate what you've done tonight. It's really impressive, and I look forward to seeing you and talking with you more.
Thank you, Randy. Mary Lamphere, did you have something? I saw that you unmuted.
Oh, did you get my note about Basali?
Oh, and so Mary's connecting us with more speakers. So yes, Mary, we'll go through that together too. So yeah, she's got like 4 lined up or something. They all sound wonderful. So I'm really excited. I did get your note. I didn't
Okay.
respond. Sorry. I think that's it. So thank you so much for being here, spending your time and attention, which is your energy, with us this evening. And we hope to see more of you, for those that don't come around often. And for those that do, I can't wait to see your faces next week.